Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, relief help. The Mets need it. We go through who recently signed, who's still out there, and what makes sense for this team. We also go down on the farm, looking at the pitching depth within the Mets system. Finally, we of course talk about if the team will actually add a DH this offseason and answer your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You could watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today, and here's your reminder to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch all the episodes on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. And it's time for the final countdown, the final push. It's the bottom of the ninth, and it's Game 7. The voting closes on January 28th. Please go to sportspodcastawards.com and vote for the Mets Pod in our categories of Best Baseball Podcast and Best Team Podcast. Tell all your friends. We appreciate it. And for those of you that have already voted, that have tweeted at us, thank you very, very much. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo, as the MLB offseason kind of rolls on here, Joe. We've had a couple of relievers come off the market this week. That's how you know it's a slow offseason. When Aroldis Chapman gets a headline. It's not Aroldis Chapman from 5 years ago or anything like that. It's actually news. So the relief market has been crawling here, Joe, and we do know it's the one market that the Mets absolutely will still be active in. So what have been your thoughts of the guys that have gone and the guys that are still out there, and how it stands for the Mets that desperately need a high leverage guy before Edwin Diaz right now?
So first off, Sports Podcast Award, make sure you vote. I've put out a couple tweets. If you show a screenshot to me and you tweet me that screenshot that you voted, I will do a personal mailbag for just you on Twitter. Nice. You ask a question, I'll answer whatever it is. But please go
thank
vote.
You very much.
Yeah. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your sister, your brother, tell everybody. We really want to come out with one of these awards, if not both, but at least one would be wonderful. But back to the bullpen. Yeah, the market's starting to finally move. After Josh Hader signed with the Houston Astros, that was kind of the big fish to kick things off. Almost immediately after, Robert Stevenson signed with the Angels. And I believe the Mets were interested in Robert Stevenson, but they were certainly not interested in Robert Stevenson at the price of 3 years, $33 million with a fourth-year option. John Brebbia went off the market for $1 year and $5 million. The Mets were connected to him a couple of weeks back by Joel Sherman. Aroldis Chapman, like you mentioned, 1 year, $10 million or $10.5 million to the Pirates. Mets were kind of connected to him by SNY's Andy Martino. So that's the one market that, you know, we could campaign for Jorge Soler, and we'll talk DH here in a bit. David Stearns has explicitly said they're going to add to their bullpen. So that market is finally moving, and I would suspect it probably continues in that route this week into next week, and hopefully the Mets are able to get after one, at minimum, or two of the relievers left on the market.
Right. I think it'll be last year, and this was different because it was very early in December 9th, David Robertson signed that 1 year deal, and the money was significant in that, but it's a 1 year deal.
It was like Chapman's deal, I believe. I believe it was the same deal Chapman signed. It was like 10 or 10.5.
Right. Exactly. It was right around there. So I think when you look at it, the Mets will be, we know the theme of the Mets offseason, and this is kind of a theme of a lot of teams that look for relief help. They want to keep the, obviously, years down on these contracts because, Joe, something we've talked about on this podcast for how many years is, you know, just the volatility of the position. I mean, Aaron Loop is our pinnacle example. He has a historic year with the Mets. He goes and gets paid with the Angels, and we were, you know, half joking, but just kind of making the point that you look 2 years later, his career or his stint with the Angels, he had an ERA right below 5. It's just unbelievable how up and down these guys can be, and why you don't see a lot of deals like Edwin Diaz and Josh Hader got. And those guys got those deals because they're the best in the game. It's as simple as that, and they're the closers. Now, We've heard the Mets kind of poking around a guy like Hector Neris, who's super interesting because Mets fans know him well from his time with the Phillies, where he was the closer for the Phillies. He was a little bit of a roller coaster, as most relievers are with the Phillies. This was a guy that had some really good years, and it felt like every other year he had a down year. And like pitchers do, he goes to Houston, and he's been absolutely fantastic the last 2 years. He was really lights out, specifically last year as a 34-year-old. So we'll see if that's one. I think that would be, Joe, in my opinion, more of the upper echelon. If the Mets were able to get Neris, that would be, they're going to go out and either be willing to give that second year, or they're willing to go 1 year. 15 mil. You're talking about a significant 1 year deal if you get a guy like Neris. But like you said, I think hearing them connected to a lot of these names just goes to show you that it's safe to say they're in on an 8th inning guy right now, because the Mets have a lot of questions of who will actually be in this bullpen. But one question you don't want to have going into the season is who is going to be the bridge to Edwin Diaz. And it feels like that's the Mets' mission right now, to solve that equation.
It's very important because Edwin Diaz coming off the injury, we talked about this, I believe, a couple of weeks ago on this show. He's going to be pitching from all accounts, unless there's some setback that's unknown. He's going to be pitching basically like a normal season. With that said, do they early on kind of tailor his usage and not use him in, every save opportunity? Occasionally you want to give the opportunity to someone else and give him the chance to kind of ease himself into 100% health, because the reality is Edwin Diaz is under contract for like 4 more years. So you don't want to, overdo it off the significant injury he had in the month of April. So I think maybe even more important than when they signed David Robertson last year is that they get that lockdown 8th inning guy. I think the bullpen is maybe a little more together than we think. If you really kind of like put the puzzle together, you have Diaz, I consider him a lock. Brooks Raley, Drew Smith,
for sure,
Jorge Lopez, and probably a long man of some kind, whoever that is, whether that's a Lucchesi, a McGill, Jose Buto, but a long reliever of some form. Then you add one reliever, you now have 6 in your bullpen. You carry 8. The Mets have a lot of guys in on non-roster invites. They claim guys on waivers, some of which are out of options. So you certainly want to have competition for at least one spot. You could justify 2, but it is of utmost importance, I think, that the Mets get someone that they can rely on for the 8th inning. That could be a Hector Neris. That could be a David Robertson if he wants to come back. Ryan Stanek is a favorite of mine. Doesn't seem like the Mets want my favorites, but if they do, Ryan Stanek's a favorite of mine, so they can go ahead and do that. Matt Moore had a really good year, and he's someone that I think could profile there. So right now, there's still 45 relievers out on the market per MLB trade rumors. So there's plenty of inventory for the Mets to sift through and figure out who the right fit is for them.
Without a doubt. And you brought up some of the names that are in the bullpen currently. A lot of people kind of, they get the chills when they hear Drew Smith, but Drew Smith's a guy that doesn't have options, and you need to look at relievers. And
he's been good. He just wasn't good last year, right?
He wasn't good last year.
Smith, yeah.
He wasn't good last year. And I think that it's interesting how we think of relievers. And I understand Drew Smith gave up a lot of poorly timed home runs last year. I've watched every game, folks. Like, I'm not denying any of this. But the bottom line is, number one, you're right, Joe. In 2021, he pitched over 40 innings and had a 2.4 ERA. In 2022, he pitched 46 innings and he had a 3.33 ERA. I'll take that from the 6th and 7th inning guys. A 3.33 ERA, right, giving you innings. His strikeouts were 10.4. Last year, the home runs were just up, and the ERA went up with them to 4.15. But you don't just discard arms like that. That's just not how you operate as a major league team.
Especially ones making like $2 million from arbitration or so.
Yeah. 100%. So the point is, though, how do you lesser the role, I think, in terms of high leverage spots? And Brooks Raley, we almost take him for granted, a 2.80 ERA last year. He's absolutely in the mix of those 8th innings to get the ball to Diaz. But you need that second guy. And you look at the Ottavino situation, so interesting, right? Because he had a 3.21 ERA last year, but it felt like he had a lot of rough outings, just put in spots and just couldn't get them through a spot, or couldn't close a game, or was, just rough in setup situations. And when he decided to become a free agent, it's not that the Mets completely closed the door, but I feel like, I don't know. It's one of those ones where it feels like it was probably best for both sides, where I'm not thinking Ottavino is going to come back on this reworked deal in this situation. It feels like the Mets just need something different. So, like you said, not a lot, but a handful of spots will be figured out between the Michael Tonkins of the world. Like, that's the kind of names we're thinking of here that you go out and get.
Johan Ramirez, and
Yes,
then who they claimed, and then you look at a guy like Max Kranick, who could
that's
be
an
a
interesting
bulk
one.
a
Yes.
bulk inning guy that they claimed from Pittsburgh. You could look at Kyle Crick on a non-roster invite. So there's some competition, and Mets fans are cringing and like whatever right now. I get it, but there's a lot of times every single year you see it, and David Stearns has been a executive that has pulled this off countless times in Milwaukee, where there's some guy that I never heard of that's all of a sudden a really good 7th or 8th inning man every single year. So with him in charge, you got to say, why can't the Mets do that?
100%. And that's part of the evaluation process, and why a guy like Stearns and the people he brings with him, let's not forget that for those listening, it's not just Stearns, but the people he brings with him, what is supposed to make them different. So we'll keep an eye on the bullpen situation. I'm sure we're going to have at least one big signing to break down within the coming weeks. All right, let's go down on the Yeah, I hope so too. We're starving for some news here, even a crumb of news. Let's go down on the farm here before we get to that DH conversation, because last week we talked a lot about Christian Scott and Mike Vassell. If you're more interested in hearing about those guys and you missed the episode, just check out last week's. Both are working out in Florida. We'll talk plenty more about them in weeks to come when we see more of them. But the next tier of starters here, Joe, and what we should expect from them in months to come in this system: Blade Tidwell, Tyler Stuart, Dominic Hamel, Justin Jarvis, who was the acquired arm in the Marcana to Brewers trade. So I think Stearns knows a thing or two about him. Calvin Ziegler, who you and I think had on our old show. Really, really nice guy with big time stuff and dealt with some injuries, but excited to see him healthy this year. I mean, those are just the names that we really know of. One, did I miss anyone? And two, I mean, I don't think all these guys are projected to be legit MLB starters, but it's nice that the Mets actually have some depth of pitching at all levels of the system, because that has not existed for a couple of years now.
Yeah, I would probably note Brandon Sproat, the 2nd-round pick from last year as well. But just talking about this list, and to your point, Connor, where the Mets are and what they've been building towards for the last couple of years is to have pitchers in the upper levels of the minors to make up their starting pitching depth at the big league level. So you are not relying on too many starts from I always hate to go back to Jared Eichhoff, but he's just like the 4A starter that I always think of. Like, you avoid going to like that well too much. And like you said, some of these guys won't end up starters. Some of them will end up relievers. Some of them will end up not major leaguers. That's the nature of kind of the business that we're in. But if you want to talk, I'll go quickly about each guy. Blade Tidwell, former 2nd-round pick. He was my number 1 pitching prospect in the system. He's probably going to be number 2 when I update, but it's still incredible stuff. Fastball, that'll touch 97, wipeout slider, developing a changeup. I would guess he probably starts back in AA with the opportunity to get to AAA at some point this season. Tyler Stuart, he either led or for most of the year led all of minor league baseball in ERA, and he was a 6th-round pick reliever that the Mets converted to a starter, much like they did with Christian Scott, which has proven to be a great example. I think Stuart right now is lacking that 3rd pitch and might end up going back to the bullpen in the future. But I would expect him to probably join Blade Tidwell in AA. Dom Hamel is a pitcher that I'm especially high on, probably more so than most in the community. I think his stuff really reminds me of Seth Lugo in a lot of ways. It's got that mid-90s fastball that'll touch like 95 with kind of that life and jump on it. He's got a big-time breaking ball, upwards of 3,000 RPMs that gets a ton of swing and misses. He's got to hone in on the 3rd pitch. Otherwise, he could be kind of in that in-between area that Lugo was, where it was like, is he a starter? Is he a reliever? But I think Hamel, he accomplished what he needed to in AA, and I would expect him to start the year in AAA Syracuse. Justin Jarvis, as you mentioned, from the Marcana trade, not really a big stuff guy. Kind of looks more like a long reliever in my eyes, and I think he'll certainly be in AAA Syracuse where he ended the season. I'd be interested to see, is he in the AAA rotation, or is he used like a long reliever, bulk innings guy out of the bullpen there? And last one, we'll touch on Calvin Ziegler quickly. He just came back at the end of the year from injuries. I believe he tore his quad or hamstring or something like that. He missed almost all the year with that. Came back, had a 1-2-3 inning with 3 strikeouts in his only appearance. But the stuff is obviously
Insane.
legitimate when he's healthy. It's
Yeah.
up to 96, 97, big time downer curveball. And back when we interviewed him back on our old show back in the day, I remember asking him about his changeup, and he held up a baseball with a splitter grip on it, and he's like, I throw a split change now. So he needs to keep refining that pitch, but he carries a baseball around almost all the time, spreading his fingers to make the splitter grip more efficient. So he just walks around in his downtime with a baseball. So not going to bet against him.
No.
And the pitching is coming along in the Mets minor league system. It's been a bit, but it's coming along.
Ziegler, I think, is the guy I'm most excited to watch, Joe, because like you said, he was hurt last year, and it wasn't an arm injury. So he just
probably Brooklyn for Ziegler, by the way. Sorry to cut you off.
Right.
I would guess
No.
Brooklyn to start. Yeah.
That's a good call, because I wanted to call back in 2022 when he was just 19 years old. He was obviously an A-ball at St. Lucie, and he struck out 13.5 over 9. This is a guy that, that's how he gets his outs. He makes guys miss foolishly. So that's somebody that type of profile of stuff is exciting. And then 2023, a lost year, but it wasn't an arm injury where it's, hey, this is, we've seen him come back and throw at the end of last year. And like you said, he struck out the side. And then he'll be a 21-year-old. I want to make sure. Yeah, he'll be a 21-year-old this year, probably in Brooklyn. So when you have that kind of stuff, I mean, we'll see. He could be a fast riser, maybe even as a long-term reliever with that kind of high leverage stuff as well. So we'll keep an eye on all these guys. That's what we do on the Mets pod. We love talking about the big league club and the offseason moves, but with Joe here, and I have absolutely been roped into it completely, we will never get away from the farm system. And this is, man, the best time in a long time, Joe, to talk about the Mets farm system. I mean, when was it? I know there's not superstar talent. We watched Alvarez like a star, and we don't consider him in the system anymore. But when was the last time that you covered it that this kind of depth existed at all the levels?
It's been quite a while. I mean, this is the deepest it's been. There's been times where I've put together top 20 lists for SNY, and when I got to 17, I was like, I'm really stretching here to fit people. Now I'm going to have to either expand to 30 or cut people out that I think would be top 20 guys in a normal year. So last trade deadline helped a lot. The drafting that the Mets have done over the last couple of years has helped. So yeah, the system is in pretty good shape. And I suspect when all these main publications put out their farm system rankings, the Mets are going to be, depending on where you look, probably somewhere in the 8 to 12 range. So it's like a top 10 or so farm system in the sport with obviously a lot of investment and interest in making it even better.
All right, let's get into basically this is a new segment, our DH corner. Will they, won't they? And I'm joking because we're not doing this all year, but we will do it all offseason. I mean, Joe, I think you and I have started to skew the same way, and I think the fan base has too. I've seen less outcry and hopes for this. I feel like the wind is just out of their sails right now. And you could always be surprised because they're all out there. That's the funny thing. The mood has changed. We are not convinced the Mets are going to go sign a DH anymore. It doesn't feel like the fan base has their eyes on that as much anymore. Yet, nobody has signed. Jorge Soler is still out there. Justin Turner is still out there. JD Martinez is out there. You would think, with the lack of news about this player, that Rhys Hoskins is no longer a professional athlete. It's crazy to me. This guy was a really good player before he missed last year due to injury. So, Joe, I mean, where's your – I'll set it like this. Where is your – it's weird to call it confidence level because it's the wrong word, but just your overall level 1 to 10 that you think the Mets actually add a bat. And Turner counts, even though we think he could play the field a little bit. It's starting to just feel like they are going to look at Vientos and look at these young players and ride into spring training with what they have. But what are your thoughts?
It's what it feels like, and it's not going to stop me from doing my old Bernie Sanders meme, which thank you, SNY, for making that tremendous thing.
Post.
Yeah, loved it. But it's not going to stop me from saying the Mets should sign Jorge Soler, especially if his market falls to a 1-year deal for whatever. But
that enhances it.
anywhere you read, it doesn't sound like it's a priority. And what I will say is we have spent a lot of time on this show talking about giving Brett Beatty the opportunity to be a third baseman. We spent a lot of time on this show talking about wanting to get Drew Gilbert up here, wanting to get Luis Angel Acuna up here. Is it a little hypocritical of us to then say we don't want Mark Vientos to be the DH when we want to give all these other young players an opportunity? In a way, I think it kind of is. With that said, the DH position where it's different for me, and because I think I've had people ask me on Twitter, what's the difference between giving Brett Beatty a shot and giving Mark Vientos a shot? On the free agent market, there's no impact third baseman other than Matt Chapman, who's going to cost you a qualifying offer and $100 and something million. Then on the DH side, like you talked about, none of them have signed. The market's not there. It's all these guys are probably gonna have to sign 1-year deals. If I could for 1 year make a real upgrade to this lineup, I would do that. But my confidence level in them doing it is dissipating by the day. And, obviously Mark Vientos is working very hard. I have heard he's already working with Eric Chavez. Like he is on it trying to improve. So obviously if Mark Vientos is the guy, we're going to root like heck for him. And it leaves opportunity for half days off for someone like Starling Marte or someone like Pete Alonso, guys like that. So it leaves some flexibility on the roster, but it's disappointing too that this is an opportunity where the Mets can reasonably make a real upgrade to their team as they want to be playoff contenders. That's David Stearns has said it everywhere he can. Andy Martino on SNY kind of pushed him on it, and he stayed with that message. So I think it's just from the DH standpoint, a little inconsistent, right? That you want to contend, but you don't want to take that type of opportunity for 1 year. Just leaves me a little uneasy.
That's where I'm at. I think I look at it like this, to get back to your point. I don't disagree entirely about the hypocritical nature of it. But what I will say is, and we are Mets fans, and everybody listening to this is a Mets fan. They know this. People are going to get hurt. People are going to need days off. People are going to need rest. The Mets are in a situation that, say everything goes perfect, right? That would mean Starling Marte is back and healthy. That would mean Brandon Nimmo stays healthy throughout a full season. That would mean Harrison Bader stays healthy throughout a full season. That's not the case with any of those guys. It's not. So say 2 of the 3 stay healthy throughout a full season. That is almost a surprise. That's almost overachieving. The reality is all 3 of those guys get banged up. They're athletic. They play aggressive. They, are obviously plus defenders for the most part. I know Marte hasn't been that way since he got hurt, but so the outfield is one where I think you could blink and you're like, wow, our outfield got thin really, really fast because the guys that are good players that we like, but are hurt most years, got hurt because it's another year. So I think I look at it like this situation where I think at the end of the day, if you sign a DH, it feels so far from reality that there's this world that you're taking away from someone. It just feels inevitable that things are going to open up because this is professional sports and guys get hurt. And especially the roster the Mets have. I mean, the Mets have one of the most 2 Iron Men in baseball in Francisco Lindor and Pete Alonso. People get hit by pitches. There's nothing you could do. Pete got hurt last year. He came back from what we thought would be a 2-month injury in 13 days or whatever it was. So it's just the inevitable of the sport. I think they could do both. I'm not convinced they're going to. And maybe they've played this perfectly, Joe. I would love to get on here in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and be like, wow, they waited out the market. They sent out all the buzz that they're not really looking to spend at that area. And then they were able to lure in one of the 3 to 4 guys we talk about all the time on a 1-year deal that has no ramifications beyond this year. And it would be phenomenal. I want to give them the chance to do that.
Right. And when you look at the outfield depth chart, and you mentioned the injury history of Harrison Bader, that's well established. Starling Marte's isn't so much, but it obviously was a significant one last year. So you have to see he's going to bounce. And he's getting older. So those things, typically you don't get more healthy as you age, which is why I specifically have targeted Jorge Soler. And yes, I know he is not a particularly good outfielder. And people got after me on Twitter about this. I'm not comparing Jorge Soler to Kyle Schwarber, but if the Phillies, who make the World Series and the NLCS, can trot Kyle Schwarber out in left field defensively, the Mets, who are trying to win 84 games or 85 games, can trot Jorge Soler out in right field for a day. They're going to survive. So I think it plays a role from the outfield depth chart. If you don't want JD Martinez, fine. I get not wanting to clog the DH hole with someone that is only a DH and that's all he can do, and it leaves no flexibility for other guys to get half days off and things like that. Fine. But to me, passing on Jorge Soler, especially if the market keeps falling the way it is, it's going to be pretty disappointing.
Yeah, I think that's where it stands right now for us. So we'll keep an eye on this one. It's a market that just has not moved, and we haven't heard the Mets having a significant interest in it. We've heard them check in. I mean, it feels like months ago we heard buzz.
What is checking in? Is that like when you annoy someone in your fantasy football league? You'd be like, hey, is Christian McCaffrey available? And they just don't answer you? Is that what checking in is?
So my experience from this, it's a good way of putting it. My experience from this in football, being closer to the agent side and team side there, is that can range from, hey, what is he looking for? And that'll start with money per year, of course, the term. And I think with the Mets, it's safe to say when they check in, they're checking in on term. Is this somebody that's willing to take a 1-year deal, or is that not in the cards for you? And hey, we're not interested in that. Okay, if your market isn't what you think it is, call us back if it falls down to being a 1-year deal, because we might offer more cash in that 1 year than the other teams. So, or you look at a guy like Rhys Hoskins, who goes back to your point, Joe, like you don't want a DH clogger, and the Mets don't need somebody to play first base on occasion even. But Hoskins is a guy that it doesn't make any sense for him to take a deal beyond 1 year right now, because he's 30 years old. He'll be turning 31. And the reality is he wants to probably hit free agency again as a 31-year-old next winter, coming off of a year where he hit 30 home runs again. He didn't get to play last year. So he doesn't have that leverage. Nobody's giving Rhys Hoskins a 5-year, $125 million deal right now. But can he get that next offseason if he hit 30 home runs somewhere this year? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Probably.
Why not?
He makes perfect sense as a 1-year candidate for sure.
Exactly. So, all right, we'll keep it moving here because we got a lot of good mailbag questions, and I want to allocate the right amount of time to them. So before we get there, you're listening to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. The mailbag this week, of course, sent to Joe at PSL The Flushing, at my handle, at Connor J. Rogers. This one from Johnny. He asked, do either of you have any unique ideas about what a City Connect jersey could or should look like from the Mets? So, Joe, we finally actually got some news here that they will be worn for the first time in April, which is pretty early in the season. City Connect is usually spread throughout the year. The Mets are obviously up pretty early in the year 3 of the City Connect jerseys. Yeah, according to UniWatch, I think April 26th is the date that they're going to wear them for the first time in game, and they'll be unveiled like a week or two before, and maybe a leak will come out beforehand that we'll get a look at it. The one thing that I want to think about here is the Mets released through UniWatch. So Mets didn't release. Sorry, UniWatch released the new black jerseys that are kind of taking over for the black jerseys that the Mets had, removing the white piping, which I think looks really cool on the hat. Doesn't hit the same on the jersey for me. Maybe it'll be better in reality than pictures. Sure. But if they're doing a new alternate black jersey this year, that leads me to believe I don't think City Connect is also going to be black. Like, are they going to make a lot of sense? 2 black jerseys in the same season? I don't know. Is it going to be an orange-based jersey, like a white with an orange or something? Because there's not really, I don't know. There's not a ton of like orange out there in kind of Mets stuff. It used to be like a spring training jersey. So I'm interested to see how creative they get. They could go off the wall. I mean, the Padres have rainbow color jerseys or whatever, the crazy colors that have nothing to do with their scheme. So it's unpredictable. I don't know what they could do. What would you want to see, Connor? It's a good question, because number one, it's called City Connect for a reason. These uniforms literally do have a tie-in with the city the team plays in. So I think my number one ask is, if preaching to Nike here, is that the Mets uniform should be associated with Queens somehow, because the Yankees play here too. If you just make it New York themed, Manhattan skyline, things like that, that doesn't really do anything for me, because you could say it could look like something the Yankees could wear. It needs to be, in my opinion, specific to Queens. And the only thing we know with the Mets that is very specific to Queens is the 7 train. So do you do some kind of subway theme? Now, back to your point, Joe, because these are the hardest to predict. They literally are. They're not like alternates for other leagues or even baseball, because we've seen them go so different with the color palettes. I mean, Boston, I thought, was very, very tasteful with the marathon style uniform, as much as that was far away from the Red Sox. You look at the Marlins. The Marlins did the throwback to a Miami themed team. I believe it was a Cuban team. I forget where the uniforms originally stemmed from, but they're like red, right? But they're an ode. They're paying homage to a previous team. So in the area, that's the whole point. So with the Mets, it's now, Joe, do they go something trying to kind of tie in the Giants and the Dodgers? I don't think they will, and I'm obviously talking about Brooklyn Dodgers here, not the current Dodgers, but do they try to mix in something like that? Are these colors totally, remember the Rockies were green and white.
I love the Rockies.
I do too.
Once they went to white pants instead of the pants that matched the jersey, I love the Rockies. They're probably my favorite City Connect jersey, like the top of it.
The Marlins were a tribute to the Cuban Sugar Kings. I knew it was a Cuban team. I wanted to get that right. So they've done a lot of research with how they've honored these uniforms in these cities and connected it to the area. And I think they if they want to do it right, do it somehow to Queens. Now, and I agree with you, Joe. Don't just make it a black uniform. Don't just make it, blue. It wouldn't shock me, since they've gotten really crazy with these, if it is orange or something in that regard. I don't want red for the apple. I've seen that. I don't want it. I think it could go really, really bad. They could look like a walking Christmas ornament. It's very, very scary to think about if they jump too far into the apple thing. So, I mean, we love talking uniforms on this, and we've been waiting for the City Connect. This is now year 3, because the Mets were in the last year of it. So we'll be all over this as well. All right, another question here. This one from Serious Will. Outside of Senga, the rotation consists of players on short-term deals. Are they putting too much faith into Vassell and Scott being able to lock down spots in the rotation for 2025?
So Sean Manaea is technically under control next year, so we don't want to remove him from
the equation. He could opt out.
Just because he can doesn't mean necessarily they will. Depends how he pitches. With that said, you also have, no one wants to hear about David Peterson and Tyler McGill and Jose Buto, but those guys are still going to be under contractual control, at least as depth. But I think, to the overall question, they're certainly hoping for one of these young players to establish themselves to take a rotation spot. But that's why you and I have said on this show, we want to start with more control. We've talked about Brandon Woodruff. We talked about guys on the trade market that could be available for, beyond 2024. And frankly, that's something they could address at the trade deadline too. Like at the deadline, they could, whether they're buying or selling, they could buy for 2024. There's no rule that says you have to buy or sell at the trade deadline. You could do both. So if the season doesn't go fantastic, you could sell off some rentals and buy something for next year. Like that's something that the Mets can do. But they're setting themselves up for a bit of a risky year, where they're going to look a lot at these young pitchers a lot, and they're really relying on at least one of them hitting, because otherwise you're rebuilding 3 to 4/5 of a rotation again next year, and that's really, really hard to do. I know we play fantasy GM on this show and Twitter and everywhere, but it ain't that easy to just fill out a rotation in one off season.
No, it's not. And you nailed it. You're hoping that one of the prospects shows enough this year that you're writing him in for next year. And that could be at the 4 or 5 spot. That's not, we don't need Matt Harvey and, Jacob deGrom, where you have a locked
I love it.
24. That'd great. Right. I think one idea I'd have, Joe, is that if Quintana pitches the first half of this year like he did in the second half of last year, I would try to extend Quintana in season. I would go to Quintana and be like, if you like it here, we'd love to still have you here. Let's find something that works. He's an older pitcher that's very effective, because that is the kind of 3 or 4 that I'd rather just go into the offseason having. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to go overpay for a 3 or a 4 on a 5-year deal. So then you're lining up with you're almost lining it up 1, 3, 5, right? Senga, who's not maybe a traditional ace, but who knows? Actually, who knows? I mean, to be fair, the guy was floating around the Cy Young voting last year, so I'm not going to pretend that I know that. But him as the 1, Quintana as the 3, and then one of the young guys that does well this year is the 5. And then you have flexibility. If you go out and get one of the aces, then Senga's the 2, and you have a 1, 2, 3, and a 5. You get a 5, and then somebody has to pitch like a 4. But it's just flexibility. So, yeah, that would be one of my ideas if I was nervous about, oh, wow, we're going into the offseason. We need to sign 3 starting pitchers, and everybody knows it, so we're going to get taken for a ride in free agency. All right, the last question here from Dean Julia. If they decide to go the Vientos route at DH, do you think they'll commit to it fully and give him the full run at the DH job, or mix and match? I'd love to see a big sample size from Vientos to truly see what that bat looks like ups and downs. What do you think of that, Joe?
I would hope they would give him a legitimate run. We've been asking for a legitimate run for 2 years. So if you're not going to sign Jorge Soler like Connor and I just so nicely ask of the Mets to do, then just beg, please. But if not, let Mark Vientos get the bulk of the DH at bats. That doesn't mean there won't be days that, like we said a little earlier in the show, that Starling Marte doesn't get half a day off, or Alvarez, who you mentioned, a couple weeks back, Connor, maybe he gets half a day off and gets the DH. Alonso, like there's
Marte,
you could sprinkle those guys in a bit. And let's also not forget, like, Mark Vientos technically can play a couple positions. So it's not like if he's not DHing, he's automatically on the bench. He could play third base against a tough lefty one day. Like, again, not a great defensive third baseman, can live with it for a day. He can play some first base. So I would hope Mark Vientos would get a real opportunity to establish himself as a near everyday player, because when he got opportunity in September, you saw the power really come out in a meaningful way. It's very difficult, more difficult than I think people want to think about. Mark Vientos was the star of his high school team. He was a 2nd-round pick. He was a highly regarded prospect all the way through. This guy has never sat on the bench probably in his life. And It's difficult to sit on the bench for 4 days and then say, hey, Mark, you're playing on Friday. You better get like 3 hits or you might not play again for another 5 days. So hopefully, like they intend to do with Brett Beatty and some of the other young players, if they aren't signing a DH, they let Mark Vientos have near everyday at-bats. And if they do, would it shock you if Mark Vientos popped 20 home runs this year? Like, that wouldn't knock me off my chair. He hit 6 in
what he's
September.
Supposed to do.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, if he hits 20 homers, that shouldn't shock anybody.
His splits are really weird, right, with Vientos. And I think, going back to the original question, I think this raises a really important point from Dean, that if you're not going to go sign someone, because we're not acting like these DH candidates that are in free agency right now are serious investments. They're not getting 4-year deals. They're not even getting 3-year deals. We don't even know if anyone's getting a 2-year deal. So if you make the decision that you're not going after one of them, I'm not saying Vientos needs every DH at bat in the world, because guys need time off, like you said, Joe, from the field. Some guys just need a day. You do need to utilize that in a sense. But it would be extremely short-sighted to not give him a legitimate run, because you got to find out at some point. And I think why you could be concerned about it is Vientos was a guy that demolished left-handed pitching in AAA. I mean, his OPS was over 1,000. He was hitting highlight reel home runs that we watched on social media every single night. And last year, in only 88 plate appearances, so I want to see more, he had a 584 OPS. He just couldn't figure out left-handed pitching in the majors like he destroyed in the minors. Now, to your point, Joe, why we should be at least curious is Vientos had a much more promising September, October. Not great, but the OPS was up to 739, which if Vientos has an OPS around 750 this year, but he's hitting his home runs, okay, let's see that's a trajectory that's going the right way. Where areas in August, he couldn't do literally anything. His OPS was under 500. So I would like to see him being able to work through things like he was able to do in the minors. Like you said, like he's been able to do his whole life. And if he simply can't do it by June, okay, then let's see somebody else that's having a lot of success in the minors and give guys more DH time. And it didn't work. But yeah, I think you raised a great point that young players that are working through things, adversity, for the first time in their entire big league career, if you don't give them that advantage at the most difficult level in all of baseball, I don't know if that's really fair. I'm not saying I expect Vientos to be a success story, but I also could sit here confidently and can tell you that I don't have the confidence to tell you he just doesn't have it. I don't think that's fair either.
David Stern's, the word he used was runway, right? You want to give the young players runway to be able to go through the lumps. And he said in an interview with Andy Martino with SNY, even in New York, we can have patience. Like, fans don't want to hear that, and they think of patience in a different sense, right? Like, I'm an older fan. I've been waiting so long to see a World Series. I've had people say that to me on Twitter. And guys, the Mets haven't won the World Series in my life. You don't think I want to see one? Like, I totally get it. But patience in the sense of allowing young players the chance to take those bumps, because on average, more success stories in Major League Baseball from young players that become legitimate players, go look at their first year numbers or their first 400 plate appearances. A lot of them struggled. It takes time. It takes patience. So even though we're in New York, you got to give it a shot. I'll still campaign for Jorge Soler until he comes off the market. But I think, to your point, Connor, I'm not incredibly confident in Mark Vientos, but I'm by no means saying Mark Vientos has no chance to hit at the big league level quite yet.
And it looks like we are going to find out right as it stands right now, Joe, because there are a lot of at-bats to be had in that spot. All right, before we go, some quick housekeeping items. Our final promo for the Sports Podcast Awards, of course. Please, please, please go to sportspodcastawards.com and vote for the Mets Pod in our categories of Best Baseball Podcast and Best Team Podcast. Also, got to tease some special stuff coming for the Mets Pod, both of the event and guest variety that we'll announce in coming weeks. So please stay tuned for that. It will not underwhelm. Let me just leave it at that. We are very, very excited. But for now, this is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And remember to subscribe to the show. You will never miss an episode if you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, watch on SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.